An interesting hypothesis that is increasingly becoming more popular, stating that the story of Atlantis is actually referring to ancient Egypt at some point of its pre-dynastic history. According to Egyptian researcher Ahmad Adli, he went back to the origins of the story of Atlantis, which was mentioned for the first time in Timaeus and Critias, the dialogues of Plato. Plato, writing about 360 BC, has Critias relate a story he heard from the elder Critias regarding a legendary trip of Solon to Egypt to learn from Egyptian priests. So that means that the origins of the story of Atlantis actually came from an Egyptian priest who told the story to Solon about 200 or 300 years before it was mentioned by Plato. He's suggesting that the pillars of Hercules are not at the Monte Hacho in Syria and Jebel Musa in Morocco. It's referring to a temple in Heraklion. Heraklion is also known as Thonis, as its original ancient Egyptian name. Heraklion was an ancient Egyptian port city dating back to the 8th century BC, located near the canopic mouth of the Nile, about 32 kilometers northeast of Alexandria on the Mediterranean Sea. It became inundated and its remains are located in Abu Qir Bay, currently about 7 kilometers off the coast, under about 5.8 meters of water and near Abu Qir. Plato referred to Atlantis as Atlantis Nissos, romanized as Atlantis Nissos, usually translated as the island of Atlas. Ahmad Adli explored the origins of the word Nissos with another Egyptian researcher, Aya El-Shimi, who is specialized in the ancient and modern Greek language. They refer to dictionaries like Liddell and Scott's Greek-English lexicon. They found that the word wasn't only used to describe an island, but it could describe peninsula as well. They refer to another dictionary, Henry George Liddell, to find that the word Nissos was used in the ancient Greek language to refer to the land flooded with the Nile, which is an exact description of ancient Egypt. Atlantis means the daughter of god Atlas. Titles like the daughter of the god or the only daughter of the god Ra are ancient and known nicknames of ancient Egypt. The translation of Atlantis as the island of God is inaccurate, yet even translating the word Atlantis to the land of God would fit ancient Egypt as well, given that the land of God used to be another nickname of ancient Egypt. Plato mentioned that the Atlanteans used to extract white, red and black stone, which matches the types and colors of the stones extensively used in ancient Egypt, like limestone, red granite, black granite and basalt. The size of Atlantis, mentioned by Plato, is comparable to the size of ancient Egypt. The end of Atlantis, mentioned by Plato, is comparable to the expected scenario of the end of an era during pre-dynastic Egypt, especially since he dated this event back to 9,000 years before Solon, so about 9,600 years BC. Here is a map that shows the location of the Heraklion or Thonis. This hypothesis is aligned with what I mentioned in my book The Pre-Dynastic Kings and the Pyramids of Egypt and the estimated dating of the pre-dynastic kings listed in this book. As explained in the book, the title Minas or Mina was developed by the new kingdom to mark the kings who start a new era. The first king that appears with that title on the Turin's papyrus is 10 kings apart from Ma'at, whom I estimated to have ruled starting from about 9640 BC. Following the approach mentioned in the book, the first king titled Minas on the Taurian papyrus would have ruled starting from about 8780 BC, which would almost exactly correspond to the same time right after the hypothesized disaster. Given that the estimated timing for the end of Atlantis is aligned with the estimated timing for the end of the ancient Egyptian pre-dynastic kings era a few years after the queen or king Ma'at, about 9640 BC. This means that Atlantis is basically ancient Egypt during one of the pre-dynastic eras before 8780 BC, and that the Atlanteans are the ancient Egyptians of the pre-dynastic era, who lived before the first Minas, mentioned on the Turin papyrus about 8780 years BC. Let's talk about the inscriptions of the Edfu Temple and the Atlantis story. The Temple of Edfu is an Egyptian temple located on the west bank of the Nile in Edfu. It is one of the best preserved shrines in Egypt. The temple was built in the Ptolemaic kingdom between 237 and 57 BC. So it's a late temple. Yet in Edfu Temple as well, there are indications that it was built on top of an older temple, which is a pretty typical scenario in many of the ancient Egyptian temples. Those indications include inscriptions on the walls of the temple and the stones of some parts of the flooring of the temple, which has inscriptions from older eras on their bottom side. The temple might have its roots in the pre-dynastic era as well. Some of the inscriptions refer to a disaster that destroyed the original land, and the gods who survived started to re-establish what they had had before. They built what could be referred to as primeval mounds all over Egypt, which would be the sites of all future temples and religious structures in Egypt. Some of these inscriptions are considered an indication of the Atlantis story, especially the inscriptions on the inner side of the enclosure walls surrounding the temple. Are these inscriptions talking about Atlantis? How would this fit into the hypothesis mentioned in the book The Pre-Dynastic Kings and the Pyramids of Egypt, and that Atlantis is actually ancient Egypt during one of the pre-dynastic eras? First, let's take a look at some of the Edfu's inscriptions. They are usually referred to as mentioning the story of Atlantis. Here are some of the inscriptions, as you can see. Most of these inscriptions are referring to dynastic myths, with no explicit mention or referral to Atlantis, and you will have to distort the stories almost beyond recognition to make them sound like they are an Atlantis story. However, there is a mention of what could be interpreted as land surrounded by water and gods returning to their original land after a disaster. Yet one of the drawbacks here is that it also tells us what could be interpreted that gods who survived started to re-establish what they had had before. They built what could be referred to as primeval mounds all over Egypt, which would be the sites of all future temples and religious structures in Egypt, given that most of the dynastic ancient Egyptian temples had been built on top of older structures. Some of them are likely to be pre-dynastic. It means that what they had had before was actually in Egypt and not on a distant island that was never found. Keep in mind that those inscriptions were written in a late era in the ancient Egyptian history, between 237 and 57 BC, where the myth of ancient Egypt became very diverse, sometimes contradicting each other, distorted, and already became more of speculations about the creation of the world and the pre-dynastic era. So building any conclusions based on Edfu's inscriptions would be basically a speculation based on another speculation that is probably built on an earlier dynastic speculation. Another note is that the Edfu inscriptions were written sometime between 237 and 57 BC, during the Ptolemaic period in Egypt, after at least 120 years from the date the Greek philosopher Plato wrote about Atlantis, which was about 360 BC. It will not be surprising that the Greeks made their inputs into the inscriptions. Yet, there might be a way to validate whether those inscriptions have anything to do with Atlantis by getting more information and more evidence and proof from other sources. Let's put the pieces of the puzzle together then. Based on the book The Predynastic Kings and the Pyramids of Egypt, we conclude that some of the gods of the ancient Egyptian dynastic era were actually pre-dynastic kings. The method suggested and validated through 4 different approaches based on the Palermo stone and the Turin papyrus gives us the estimated inauguration dates of 14 ancient Egyptian pre-dynastic kings listed on the Turin papyrus and the Palermo stone. Based on the flow of events and various indications mentioned in the book as well, it's likely that there was a disaster about 9500 BC that led to the end of the ancient Egyptian pre-dynastic civilization, losing their science and knowledge, and left us with very few survivors who escaped the disaster to the western desert of Egypt with very little knowledge about the civilization and science of their ancestors. The date is close to Plato's estimated date of the end of Atlantis. It's estimated that the first ancient Egyptian king after the disaster is the king entitled Minos. According to the Turin papyrus, he ruled about 8780 BC. We call this era the Sahara era, where the survivors started forming communities in the western desert and started gradually moving back to the Nile Valley as it became habitable again, leading to the beginning of the Badarian and the Naqada period about 5000 BC. While the survivors lost most of the knowledge and science of their ancestors, the ancient Egyptians of the pre-dynastic era, they did maintain some bits and pieces, and they followed the trace of the pre-dynastic structures to build their temples and monuments. The story of Atlantis originated from Egypt through the Egyptian priest who told the story to Solon. Plato then wrote about it about 360 BC. The original translation of Atlantis to the daughter of the god or the land of the god were nicknames for ancient Egypt. The hypothesized location of Atlantis is near the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules could be referring to the Heracleion north of Egypt. Plato referred to Atlantis as Atlantis Nissus. The word Nissus was used in the ancient Greek language to refer to the land flooded by the Nile, which is an exact description of ancient Egypt. None of the ancient Egyptian dynastic inscriptions or myth referred to a distant island. The Turin Papyrus and the Palermo stone show that the ancient Egyptians of the pre-dynastic era existed on the land of Egypt, at least since about 16,620 BC. Other estimates dated back to about 30,000 plus BC. The inscriptions referring to an island could be more accurately interpreted as the land surrounded by water, which refers to the Nile Valley. The evidence that a well-established civilization had been already existing on the same land for a long time and not a distant island. What could be interpreted from the Edfu inscriptions as gods returning to their original land or homeland is simply describing ancient Egyptians and their kings returning from the Egyptian western desert to their homeland of the Nile Valley when it became habitable again. And they started building on what they had before, which is aligned with the archaeological evidence. The conclusion is pretty obvious. Atlantis Nissus, the daughter of the god, the land flooded by the Nile, is referring to an era of pre-dynastic Egypt before 8780 BC, which is the era of the ancient Egyptian pre-dynastic kings. This conclusion will fit the pieces of the puzzle backed up by archaeological, historical, and astronomical evidence as detailed in the book The Pre-Dynastic Kings and the Pyramids of Egypt.